Texas A&M professor asks, when is it okay to kill whites? New York professor says having a white nuclear family promotes white supremacy. College professor says some white people may have to die to solve racism. Professor tweets that white people should commit mass suicide. College professor says kill cops, kill all white people, and kill the straights. Professor says all I want for Christmas is white genocide. Trinity College professor calls white people inhuman. Let them fucking die. USC professor calls for a Holocaust against all white people. College professor says white people are conditioned to commit mass murder.
Hello and welcome to Beholding the Truth. Very glad to be back with you here for a special documentary. It is your usual humble host Joshua here to go deeply into a controversial subject that needs to be addressed openly, honestly, with empathy, but without compromise. And so today we're going to be going into what we are proposing as the solution for the ongoing 400-year-long racial problems in America. So we have some material in front of us. This will be supported by a 53 or 54 page ebook that I have written on all of this material, including dozens of sources, governmental data, economic data, social data, and many other sources that'll be able to support what our position is in terms of the necessary solutions in order to bring some level of peace and harmony to our society as it relates to racial relations. And so without further ado, I'd first like to offer a disclaimer that all of the content in this documentary is only aiming to achieve a reduction in conflict. It is not meant to agitate animosity or ill will or violence towards any individuals or groups of people. Second, I would like to state that all of our suggestions are morally unimpeachable, and they are universal practices across the entire world. And so we're going to get into why this topic of all topics is the single highest political priority in the nation. And that is saying a lot, because there's a lot of things wrong with this nation. The economic state of it, the religious fabric of it, our position on the world stage as a declining empire. There are many social problems we could discuss, whether it's feminism or the gender issues at large, or liberalism, social concerns such as gay marriage, abortion. So I get a lot of grief when I concentrate so exclusively on racial issues. They're obviously highly divisive in this day and age, especially post-civil rights movement. People say that it's just not worth the effort. It causes too much conflict. There's too many highly emotional subjects within the racial subject that we simply can't have a constructive conversation. It always goes sideways. People are worried about hurting each other, whether it's their feelings or it creating physical conflict. But I should explain to you guys why this single issue is the highest priority issue, above the spiritual fabric of the nation, above our economic conditions, among the gender problems, all of the different social, cultural topics, the culture war, whether it's feminism, the LGBT stuff, all of that, all of those concerns come second, third, fourth, fifth to this issue, the race issue. And I know that's an unpopular opinion, but by the end of this documentary, it is inevitable that you will agree with me, because there are certain things, certain priorities that, if not addressed, they can't be fixed later on. And so I'll walk you through a quick summary of what that means. In terms of economic conditions, we all know that the cost of living has only gone up in terms of being able to purchase a home, secure wealth, and literally just feed and shelter yourself. All of these things are exponentially more difficult for the individual and for the family than they were merely decades ago. And so some people might say that the economic prosperity of the nation should be our singular key focus. We should put racial stuff aside and focus on that. Some people might say that's the culture war, and it's the genders, and it's the war on the nuclear family, and that's the single highest priority. And Christians might say none of those culture war topics are as important, and the economy isn't as important as the Great Commission, going out there and spreading the gospel. All of these things might sound logical and might sound moral and righteous. And from a spiritual perspective of being a Christian myself, I would like to believe that the Great Commission is the singular highest priority in our lives. But let me break that down just a little bit. In terms of the Christianity being the moral fabric of our nation, therefore it must be the single highest priority in all of our lives, I think we're all willing to concede, while that sounds good in theory, it's not actually what is in practice even amongst any Christian's life. For example, we all know basically 99% of all Christians out there don't secure wealth and safety, economically speaking, physically speaking, through their Christianity. They all hold jobs that are not derived from their faith. They work in the corporate world, they're entrepreneurs, they're doing something unrelated to their faith in order to secure their economic and physical safety, to meeting their basic needs, their food, their shelter, their clothing, their health care, affording for their children, their spouse, their extended family, and so on. So they are on a daily basis, to the extent of 8 or more hours per day, for years, decades of their life, they are elevating their practical needs of safety and well-being above their faith. And they're certainly not in defiance of Christianity for doing that, because one's well-being must be cared for. That's a pretty obvious thing to consider, but when you extrapolate that on a society, while it may be true that we want our nation to be majority Christian and we want the gospel to be vigorously evangelized to as many people as possible, we first must secure our well-being. And that is in terms of our economic stability and our physical safety and our ability to live in harmony with one another on a basic hierarchical needs state before we start evangelizing and concentrating on the gospel. And so, as I said, with the individual, nobody goes around condemning individual Christians for not just quitting their jobs so they can go be vagabond missionaries touring the world off of pennies a day and eating food off the street and wearing clothes that they find in a dumpster. That's not applicable at the individual level, and therefore it's obviously not applicable at the societal level as well. And so, as Christians, we have simultaneous priorities. This is not a matter of race idolatry, which white people and white identitarians are often accused of when they try to advocate for white identity or the well-being of their fellow white people. They are accused of elevating race to a higher importance in their life than their Christianity or the Great Commission. But as I said, this is obviously debunked by individual behavior. No Christian behaves with Christianity at the single highest priority in their life. They make compromises to ensure that their physical well-being and safety for their family and themselves and their communities is taken care of first. And we don't condemn them for that, nor does Jesus. So it's not a matter of race idolatry to make sure the well-being of your people is assured before you go and concentrate on the Great Commission. Now, to follow up on the fact that, okay, let's just say you have to do all those economic necessities to make sure you're taken care of and your health is safe and your economic security is safe. Why would racial issues be so incredibly important to that? Why not just concentrate on the economy? Why not concentrate on, matters of being able to protect oneself, being familiar with firearms and doing other forms of martial arts or something like that? And so now we can shift gears into why it is that racial issues, the racial demographic of the country, is the single highest political priority in our nation, where there are all of those other simultaneous priorities that we could consider to put on the top of our list to pursue, whether it's the culture war, if you want to go out and picket about abortion, or you want to go out and picket about gay marriage, or children being adopted by gay couples, or transgenderism, or any number of other political, cultural issues, or if you wanted to harp on the economy, or if you wanted to harp on our foreign policy, what nations we go to war with, who we provide financial aid for, all of these things, they're all important. However, Let's just consider a couple of things in terms of each of those issues and whether or not they are permanent or if they are transient and if they can be repaired. When it comes to the economy, we all know that this nation suffered a Great Depression little over 100 years ago. And in only my lifetime, we've suffered multiple economic recessions. And at an individual level, I have gone through long bouts of unemployment. And so I think we can all understand, whether it's at an individual or societal, a national level, we can bounce back from difficult economic times. And the same is true for all of these cultural, social issues as well. When it comes to feminism and the destructive force that it has had on our nation, feminism is an outgrowth of what is taught in these schools, what is promoted in the media, and what is celebrated at a cultural level in terms of how the genders are to see each other. All of those things can be changed in the future. The education curriculum can be changed in the future. What is promoted and normalized in the media and in Hollywood can be changed in the future to normalize the nuclear family again, to concentrate on the virtuous aspects of masculinity can be redone, to do the same for femininity, and traditionally it being concentrated on the home, the well-being of the children, and the support of their husband. That can be redefined, as I said, in the education curriculum. It can be recalibrated in the media, and the government can incentivize those things through policy, through pronatal policy, through tax incentives, and so on. So the damage that has done, feminism and these gender issues and so on, those things have obviously been destructive, but they can be reversed through policy and through reprioritization in education and media. And so it's not necessarily that the economic damage that's been done or the cultural issues that's been done, whether it's the gender wars, whether it's the normalization of non-hetero lifestyles, such as the normalization of transgenderism and homosexuality, even the spiritual fabric of the nation. Whereas America used to be a 90% Christian nation, according to Gallup polls and Pew Research studies, that has slid all the way down to 50% in the modern age. However, that being said, if you simply survey history, you can find many nations have gone through eras of apostasy and then returned and had a revival of the faith. And so all of these ills that our country is suffering at an economic and social level, they can be reversed in the future. However, the one issue that our country has been suffering from for the last 60 years that cannot be reversed in the future is the changing racial demographic. In 1960, America was a 90% white European country. And in less than one lifetime, today, America is a 58% white country. And among newborns today, whites are already a minority of the newborns born every year. And whites have a negative birth rate in the country. And every year we are inviting in millions of non-white people. And so this is a math equation that the white majority in America has precipitously declined to the extent of 32% in one lifetime and is crashing quickly. And this is also happening simultaneously all across the world. All European nations have a negative birth rate and are suffering from mass immigration of non-white people into their nations. America is simply at the most urgent state of this intentional, orchestrated attack. So this subject, some people refer to as the Great Replacement, or demographic change, or white genocide. Those are all synonymous for the same mathematical equation, the reality, according to the United States Census Bureau, and I'm sure if you've ever gone outside of your home, according to your eyeballs, if you've ever traveled to California or New York or Texas, or it's affecting basically every state in the nation, that simply go outside, you will see that there are less white people around you. And so, as I said, this is sometimes referred to as the Great Replacement or the Great Replacement theory, as if it was only a theory and not observably and empirically true. And if you go to Wikipedia right now in 2025, you will find that it refers to the Great Replacement as a theory. In fact, it says it is a debunked white nationalist far-right conspiracy theory. So let's go over what Wikipedia says the Great Replacement is. The Great Replacement, also known as replacement theory or the Great Replacement theory, is a debunked white nationalist far-right conspiracy theory espoused by French author Renaud Camus. The original theory states that with the complicity or cooperation of replacist elites, the ethnic French and white European population at large are being demographically and culturally replaced by non-white people through mass immigration, demographic growth, and a drop in the birth rate of white Europeans. Mainstream scholars have dismissed these claims of a conspiracy of replacist elites as rooted in a misunderstanding of demographic statistics and premised upon an unscientific racial worldview. And so this is the lie that has been perpetuated for our entire lives, that this is not even happening. And that especially, even if it were happening, there's no orchestrated effort behind it. And to believe that there is an orchestration behind this and that there are people in the elite tiers of society domestically here in America and internationally who are engineering this situation, that is a conspiracy theory, and it is a dangerous conspiracy theory to hold. It is a far-right conspiracy theory, and it is typically only held by white nationalists. Well, the facts, according to the United States Census Bureau, are that it is happening. It is an empirical truth that the white majority of America, as I said before, in less than one lifetime, going back to 1960, we were a 90% white country and we are now a 58% white country. And the declining white population due to our negative birth rate is accelerating, and the further accelerating of that is happening simultaneous to the mass immigration of non-white people. And so this is the objective reality that also aligns with what you see with your eyeballs. And so you have to be strong enough, have enough discernment, use enough critical thinking, check the data if you would like to understand that this is how mainstream media works. They tell you things that are obviously, observably, empirically true, are not true. We saw this with COVID. We saw this with election results in 2020. We see this all the time. And so when it comes to the reality of the Great Replacement, it is not a theory and it's not a conspiracy theory. It is objectively true. Whether or not you want to do your own research in terms of if it's being orchestrated intentionally, or if it is some kind of organic manifestation of just the changing of the times and a weird confluence of events, we can get into that in another episode. Spoiler, it is not organic whatsoever. However, that's not the intent of this episode, to go into the causes of the Great Replacement. The intent of this episode is a awakening for white people to address the reality on the ground that this is happening and why it matters. And so with social policies, as I said, like abortion, gay marriage, and so on, or economic policies like inflation, taxes, depressions and recessions, stuff like foreign policy, you have wars, tariffs, foreign aid, all of that damage from bad policy in those areas can be reversed with new policy down the road. However, when whites become the minority in the country, they will not be able to obtain the required voting majority to protect themselves or hold on to key leadership positions in government or the private sector. Minorities will continue to keep the borders open, continue to advance income redistribution from whites to non-whites, and continue to institute additional grievance-based anti-white reparational policies. That's the reality of what will happen when whites are a minority in this country. And if you need further evidence of that, there are plenty of historical examples and even current examples of what happens when whites become a minority in a country that they built. You can look at, if you want a present day example, literally happening this week, what is going on in South Africa, where you have the Afrikaners or the Boers, the white farmers, being hostilely persecuted, murdered, and their land seized by the black nationalist government. If you want historical examples, you can look at the Haitian Revolution, or you can look at what happened in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. This happens everywhere where white people build a civilization. It is highly successful, economically prosperous, safe, technologically advanced, but for whatever reason, whether or not it is just or fair, when the other non-white people living in that civilization decide that it's their comeuppance and that they should be running the civilization, the fate of the white people living there is violent death and violent persecution and the seizure of their wealth. That is the historical track record every single time this happens. And so if you think that America is somehow going to be an exception to that, then you are hopelessly naive and you're putting yourself and your progeny and the rest of this nation in danger. Now here's an interesting article from Vox, which is a media outlet. When shown the data of white genocide, something as simple as the United States Census Bureau, demographic change over the last 60 years, simply when sharing the data with white people who are generally clueless as to the extent of this change and how rapid it has come, whites immediately become more conservative and racially conscious. Quote, exposed to information about U.S. demographic change leads white people to express less favorable views towards blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, and others. They also found that exposing white Americans to demographic projections predicting a future white minority makes them more conservative, even on seemingly unrelated policies like defense spending and healthcare. This result holds even for liberal whites. They move right too, albeit from a more left-wing starting point than their conservative peers. And so this is an information war. As this article states, all we have to do is get the information out there. We don't have to make accusations or stereotype or use racial slurs or anything else. Mission number one is simply exposing the inevitable future. It's not a conspiracy theory, and you should really question why anybody would call it a conspiracy theory, to say that white people are on the trajectory in the very near future to be the minority in this country. And then you can provide the historical and present examples of what happens to white people when they become a minority in their country. Now, I'd like to get into a little bit of a different topic as it relates to the racial relations in America. That this might be hard for some people to hear, and it might be disturbing. Honestly, it was for me to find out what this study shows. But this study goes into understanding the sentiment of each race and how they feel about themselves and how they feel about the other races. And they used what's called the racial feeling thermometer, which is a 1 to 100 score. They did this study and they asked people amongst all of these different groups, how would you rate your warmth toward each racial group? They asked white individuals, Hispanic individuals, black individuals, and Asian individuals. As I said, to rank their own perception of their own group, 1 through 100, how warm do you feel toward people like yourself amongst your racial group? And how do you feel 1 to 100 towards people of each of those other 3 racial groups? Very interesting results of this study. And as I said, I was disturbed to learn this, and just like the trajectory of the soon-to-be white minority of this country, I think many white people will be disturbed to know the reality of this study. Let's break it down. Whites hold a 1 to 2% variance of bias toward themselves against every other race. When asked to score each of the races, including themselves, they ranked their perception of their fellow whites at about a 72, their perception of blacks at about a 71, perception of Hispanics, 71, and perception of Asians, 71. And so what that tells you is that white people, for the most part, don't really have any particular animosity towards other races. They don't see themselves as especially more agreeable or better to be around, more fun to be around. They don't feel especially more warm around their own people. They generally are tolerant people. And this is according to whites as self-reported amongst their own race and how they feel about others. Now let's get into how the other 3 races in this study rank themselves versus the other races. And so we're going to go straight into the primary issue, which is black perception of themselves versus how they see all of the other races, but in particular, how they see whites. Blacks actually hold, keep in mind, whites held a 1% bias in terms of how they see whites versus blacks and all of the other races. Blacks hold a 23% bias against whites, and a 20% bias against Asians, and 13% against Hispanics. Hispanics hold a 15% bias against whites, 5% against blacks, and 5% against Asians, while Asians hold a 13% bias against whites, 10% against Hispanics, and 9% against blacks. And so, as you can see, this is very, very alarming to find out that blacks score themselves and their warmth toward their co-racial peers an 85, while they hold their perception and warmth toward whites at a 62. 85, 62. That is a 23% gap between how blacks feel towards whites as compared to how whites feel towards blacks. 1% variance, 23% variance. This is a problem, and I'm doing my best to restrain myself in saying that this is merely a problem, because the rest of this episode is going to get into just how far whites have self-sacrificed and paid reparations for over 100 years to repair the racial relations between blacks and whites. We're going to get deeply into this conversation of reparations, and that black people are owed something from whites in order to absolve us from the historical sins of slavery and oppression and Jim Crow and segregation and so on. To this day, after all of those things have been done, blacks still hold on to a 23x variance of their perception towards whites as compared to whites towards blacks. And it's important to note that Hispanics hold a 15% bias against whites, scoring themselves 80% warm towards their co-racial group and 65 towards whites. Even Asians, who by and large white people seem to get along well with, who contribute very little crime and very little economic dependence in society, Asians still consciously hold a 13% preference of themselves over whites. This data alone is something that should change your understanding of the racial situation in America. Because as we all know, in the civil rights movement, the peace bringer, Martin Luther King, told us all that we are to see everyone as individuals and ignore skin color, ignore race, judge everyone by the content of their character and not the skin color. And not their skin color. That's what white people have been naively living their life practicing for the last 60 years. However, black people, Hispanic people, and Asian people very clearly still see race to a very large margin as compared to how they see themselves. They are all consciously aware of their racial groups, so much so that it affects their warmth toward the other racial groups to the tune of 15, 20, 23%. This is a problem. This is a major problem. America, accused of white supremacy and being found on racism, has invited in millions of Asians. There are currently 40 million black people here. There's currently 70 plus million Hispanic people here. There are also millions of Arabs and hundreds of thousands, if not close to a million, East Indians coming into our country. Despite us allegedly being a country founded on racism, we have over 150 million non-white people living amongst us. And it turns out that they are all highly consciously aware that their racial group is different than ours, and they prefer their racial group as compared to whites. Meanwhile, whites are living here naively, sitting here thinking that, oh, everybody sees each other as just individuals. You know, we're all just summarized by the content of our character, right? Well, not according to this study. That's not actually how society has absorbed the racial fabric of this country. Despite allowing in the mass immigration of over 100 million non-white people, despite the DEI policies, despite desegregating, despite all of the reparations paid in the various forms that we're going to get into in these following chapters, we are still seen with skepticism, and others still see themselves with preference over whites, whereas whites do not. This is a problem, and it is an unsolvable problem. There's no amount of immigration of non-white people we can allow into our country. There's no amount of elected officials, whether it's a president or a vice president or a congress member or a senator or a mayor or a governor or a district attorney, all of which we have done. There's no amount of black presidents of Harvard. There's no amount of black actors and black musicians and black athletes. There's no amount of pandering to all of these cultural priorities in terms of elevating black people that has succeeded in their perception towards whites. This study, by the way, is from 2021. This is not a study during the Jim Crow era. This is not a study that was taken during This was not a study taken during slavery. This was 2021, post-Obama, during the Biden administration, during peak DEI. Okay? And still, blacks hold a 23% bias over whites as compared to how they feel about themselves versus how they feel about white people. And Hispanics hold a 15% bias. And Asians, 13%. Whites, 1%. Let this sink in. Let this sink in before we move on to the next chapter. That's the racial feeling thermometer, just to give you a baseline understanding of the racial demographic is changing fast. This is a Titanic heading directly toward an iceberg. And if this is the sentimentality of all non-white people towards whites, while they are minorities, how do you think their perception is going to change once they become the majority and once they have carte blanche access to the levers of power, whether it's the media, whether it's the government, whether it's higher education, whether it's the finance industry? Do you think that suddenly they're going to become more favorable towards whites, more protective towards whites? Hopefully, you know what the answer to that question is. If you don't, use the present and historical examples I provided for you before with South Africa, with Haiti, and with Zimbabwe. And there are other examples. That's just one study. That's just one lens on racial sentiment. Let's look at this additional study here from Pew Research Center. Nearly half of whites say a majority non-white population will weaken America. So that's a survey from Pew Research that goes out and asks white people, hey, if America becomes a minority white country, do you think that's going to be a good thing, a neutral thing, or a bad thing? Nearly half of all white people say that's not going to be a good thing, okay, for America, not just for whites, but in terms of our economic safety, the cultural fabric of the nation, our military safety. All things considered, America will be weaker when white people are a minority in this country. That is the perception of roughly half of white people. So one thing to consider is that a little more than half of white people are so agnostic about race, care so little about their own fellow white people, that they don't even care if America is a majority white country. They don't think it matters one way or the other. So that obviously indicates that the majority of white people have far less racial consciousness and less racial bias than every other group, as explained in the previous, as verified in the previous study. But that being said, still, nearly half of all whites, a little less than half, say that no, that's not going to be a good thing for America. But here's where it gets even more interesting. When you go and ask the blacks or the Hispanics, hey, so when America becomes a minority white country, how do you think that is going to be? How do you think that that's going to play out for America? Is that going to be a good thing, neutral thing, or bad thing? Well, 80% of blacks and 73% of Hispanics think a minority white America is a good thing or it will have little or neutral impact. 80% of black people think it is either a good thing to be celebrated or that it will have no measurable meaning at all. So that's 4 out of 5. If you go talk to 4 out of 5 black people in this nation and you ask them, America is going to be a minority white country, how do you think that's going to go for America? Is it a good thing? Well, 80% of them are going to say either it's a good thing or it doesn't really matter one way or another. Now, this illustrates something we're going to get into in future chapters, the lack of understanding in terms of who provides the economic welfare of this country, who pays the lion's share of the taxes that support all of the social welfare programs that also support our military, that also support the functioning government that we live in. If they think it doesn't matter that the people who are creating the lion's share of the resources that perpetuate all of those civil institutions, then they clearly aren't making the connection that the ongoing success of the government and the economy and our military, the civil institutions that are critical for this nation to function, they have not made the connection that the people who are funding that are soon going to be the minority. And so if we go a little bit deeper into this study, something truly alarming is that 40% of black people believe that a less white America will make the country stronger. And 46% of Hispanic people think that a minority white country will make America stronger. I'm stumbling on my words here at just how alarming this data is. And this isn't some Trump survey, this isn't some white nationalist survey, this is the Pew Research Center. This is the sentimentality of blacks and Hispanics towards whites. We saw their in-group preference with the previous study. When they are asked directly about the future of the demographic fabric of the nation, again, black people, 40% of them say America will be in a stronger place when whites are the minority. And 46% of Hispanics say that America will be better off with whites as a minority. And then the slices of blacks and Hispanics that are completely ignorant in terms of what is funding the economy, 40% of blacks say, well, it'll have little impact. They have no idea that the lion's share of taxes are paid by white people. Those taxes go to things like schools, the military, our economy, all of the social welfare programs that they disproportionately receive. If they say it'll have no impact, 40% of black people. Now let's take a look at a third survey in terms of racial sentiment towards themselves versus others. In this study by Jubilee, who is a YouTube channel, they did a video called Do All White People Think the Same About Race? And you can see some screenshots in this visual here where they take a small group of individuals who are homogenous, so a group of whites and then a group of blacks separately. And so the interviewer gives them a very simple and straightforward statement and asks them what their response to that statement is. And that statement is, I am proud of my race. And they are asked to respond with if they strongly disagree, if they disagree, if they only somewhat disagree, or if they're neutral, or on the right side of the spectrum, if they somewhat agree, or strongly agree, or agree. And so the white individuals go and align themselves to these responses, and the black individuals go and align themselves to these responses. And so what you see with the results of this study in the case of whites is that the entire group align with somewhat disagree, or strongly disagree, with the exception of one individual who is bold enough to say, I somewhat agree with that statement. I am proud of my race. So you have 6 individuals surveyed here, 6 in both surveys, and 5 out of 6 disagree to varying extents up to strongly disagreeing with the statement that I am proud of my race. The most positive response is I somewhat agree with the statement, I am proud of my race. Now you go and look at the black respondents to this statement. Every single one, 6 out of 6, say they strongly agree, I am proud of my race. And so this is a third survey and study that I am showing you that demonstrates white people are not racist. White people have by far the least racial preference when it comes to attitudes toward other races, and even the most apathetic and denigrating perspective of their own race. None of the other races respond in derogatory ways towards themselves. In fact, they respond with the complete opposite. Strongly agree. 6 out of 6 people in this survey. If you were to go and do this survey at a larger scale, you would see roughly the same results. That white people are sheepish and ashamed and typically will disagree with vocally demonstrating any kind of public pride of their race. While simultaneously, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, they will all vigorously demonstrate their pride in their race. We are starting to stack up and understand just how severe the gap in racial consciousness is in this country. And keep in mind, all of this is playing out simultaneous to white people becoming a minority. You are going to have a small minority of people who are self-hating, and then an overwhelming majority of people who are very prideful and don't hesitate whatsoever to demonstrate that pride and hold a bias against the minority. That is the future. That is the inevitable reality. It's the present right now. I wish I were done providing these studies, but let's look at another lens, which is the bias of race on convictions in jury trials. We have 2 examples, one from Washington, D.C., and another from England. And it looks at the conviction rates for each individual juror on that panel. Do they find the defendant guilty or not guilty? And then it looks at the race of the defendant. And how often is there a correlation between them saying this person of this race is guilty versus not guilty? And so when we break down this study, we find that black juries have a 12% conviction rate against black defendants versus a 59% against whites. So that indicates that there is a 47% interracial bias when you have black jurors. White juries have a 33% conviction rate against white defendants versus a 26% against blacks, which actually demonstrates a negative 7% interracial bias, meaning whites are more likely to convict their co-racial group than they are to convict somebody across racial lines. Whereas black juries have a, again, 12% conviction rate against their own and a 59% conviction rate against white people. So that's a negative 7 bias for whites and a plus 47% bias for blacks. Whites are 7% more likely to convict their own people. Blacks are 47% less likely to convict their own people. Black juries demonstrate a 7x interracial bias to convict a white defendant than whites are to convict a black defendant. This is the 4th study we've shown now, demonstrating this silent, internalized bias of themselves versus white people. Are you guys starting to understand the situation yet? Here is the exact same study coming from England, where black juries have a 24% conviction rate against their fellow black defendants and a 73% conviction rate against whites, which demonstrates a 49% interracial bias. Meanwhile, white juries have a 39% conviction rate against their fellow white defendants and 32% against blacks. Again, in a completely different country, whites have a minus 7% interracial bias. They are 7% more likely to convict their own people, and blacks are 49% less likely to convict their own people. Again, in a completely different country, across the ocean, the same 7x interracial bias manifests itself. I wish we were done. However, there is more to say about the racial attitude of blacks and Hispanics as it compares to the racial attitude of whites. And so now we can go into a fifth perspective of understanding racial group behavior, and this one goes into the voting behavior of each of the races. When we look at the Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump presidential cycle, black women voted 90% for Kamala Harris. Blacks overall voted 80% for Kamala Harris. Blacks with college education voted 87% for Kamala Harris. And so the theory that, oh, well, we just got to get them educated, and that will help them understand the political landscape of this country and the most important priorities we should centralize around, such as the economy, such as our foreign policy, such as social policy. Well, 80% of all black people would have preferred Kamala Harris, whether it was because she was black and a woman, or her social policies, economic policies that are largely driven by redistribution of income, pandering to black people, DEI policies, very pro-immigration. 4 out of 5 black people would have preferred Kamala Harris and the Democrat Party to continue to run this country. So that's at the macro level of the election results and the voting behavior of each race. But then you can get into also understanding the political ideology of blacks versus whites. It's radically different, as illustrated by the approval ratings for Joe Biden while he was still in office, where there is a more than 60-point differential on how he handled the economy and his presidency overall, where you had 66% of black people thinking that Joe Biden did a good job. They approved of him. And they also say, to the degree of 62% in agreement, that Joe Biden did a fine job with the economy. When it comes to whites, only 33% of white people believe that Joe Biden holistically did a good job with his presidency. And specifically when asked about how he handled the economy, only 32% of white people agreed with that statement. And so you see half the proportion of whites as compared to blacks in terms of interpreting the political success of the Joe Biden presidency. Again, a very different understanding of what success means for this nation and what political priorities should be elevated to the highest priority of the federal government. Most alarmingly, given the context of this entire conversation and how we started out by saying the single most important political priority that all white people should have is the white majority in America, because that is irreversible. It can't be undone when it has changed. Well, how do black people feel about that? We were asked about that question in a survey before, but we can also see this data through their voting behavior. When everybody goes out and casts their votes, they do exit polls and they ask, well, among these 15 different political issues going on in the country, how would you rank these issues and how they determine who you vote for? Issues like crime, taxes, housing, abortion, inflation, immigration, LGBT issues, and so on and so forth. And what you see with this study is that the largest variance in political priorities in whites versus blacks is, you guessed it, immigration, with whites making it their number 2 priority behind only the economy. Now here's the shocking truth about immigration and how blacks feel about it. As I said, white people believe this is the single highest priority after simply being able to feed themselves, which everybody agrees with. Blacks, whites, Asians, Hispanics, we all agree that the economy, it's table stakes. We have to be able to pay for our homes and feed ourselves. But what comes next? What should be prioritized immediately thereafter? White people say immigration is the number 1 thing to come after that. Well, where does immigration show up according to black people? Is it in the top 5? No. Is it in the top 10? No. It is number 12 on their list of priorities. Isn't that fantastic? And so you now understand that they have a prejudice in terms of adjudicating criminal situations. They have a prejudice in terms of their warmth toward whites especially, but all other races. They have a apathy and even potentially celebrate, 40% of them celebrate, the future minority America. And when they come and vote, they don't give two shits about immigration. Not even close. Are you starting to understand now why having these people living amongst us with an equal say-so in how our government functions may not be the best thing for us? Are you starting to understand now with the voting behavior, with these studies about racial bias, that maybe the net impact of blacks as a whole, we're not talking about individuals, we're talking about as a whole, are not the best influence on the future of white people in this country? And so, of course, you might say, well, that was just the most recent presidential cycle. Well, sadly, going back 60 years, black people have voted for the Democrat Party, which we all understand is a package of ideas that is all about progressivism, liberalism, pro-immigration, pro-gay marriage, pro-feminism, and so on, income redistribution especially, to the tune of 80 to 90% of black people. Every presidential cycle for your entire life have voted for the Democrat Party, which, as I said, represents all of those liberal, progressive, socialist ideologies. That's 8 out of 10, up to 9 out of 10. Black people on the street. I understand, you know this one black conservative. I understand he's a nice guy. I understand he goes to church with me. We're talking about group behavior and the impact of that group on the nation's safety and future. This is a serious problem, and it's been a problem your entire life. You've just been told that you can't look at it. You've been told that you're racist if you talk about it. You've been told that you're evil and it's immoral to talk about it.